So, Dragos, many thanks to sharing the time with us. We know that you have a really busy agenda, so many thanks for sharing your time with us today. Muchas gracias también a Elena por la presentación. As we have limited amount of time, I would like to start asking questions. So the first one should be easy. And before entering in technical aspects of this proposal for our regulation on AI, what is your role within it? And what does it mean being a rapporteur of the same?
Well, I will have to do, so first of all, many thanks for this invitation. It's great to be with you in this conversation. I will do 30 seconds of pedagogy on how the legislative process works in the EU. Maybe not everyone that is following us knows or understands that. We have two co-legislators in the EU, the European Council that represents the governments of the member states, and the European Parliament, which is the directly elected institution at the European Union level, and the European Commission, which is the sole competent to make legislative proposals in the Union. So the way it works is the Commission makes the proposals, and then the Council and the Parliament prepare for the negotiations between the two of them. The Council prepares a position negotiating with the member states, and then that position is being defended and represented in the negotiations by the rotating presidency of the Council. And on the Parliament side, same thing. First, there is a negotiation inside the Parliament, which is led by a rapporteur, which is nominated by one of the political groups, together with shadow rapporteurs from the other political groups. Once there is a common position, which is called a mandate, established at the level of the Parliament, the rapporteur is responsible to negotiate with the presidency in what is being called trilogues. Why trilogues? Try because also the Commission is sitting at the table of the negotiations. I am one of the two co-rapporteurs of the Parliament. This is a bit of an exceptional situation. We don't have only one rapporteur, which is the usual way to proceed. We have two because on this particular legislative file, because of its importance, because of its relevance, there was a very strong battle inside the Parliament on the responsibility between committees. And eventually it was solved with a Solomonical decision of appointing two committees equally responsible and in charge with these negotiations. That's why there are two co-rapporteurs, myself and my colleague Brando Benifei from the Socialists and Democrats. So the two of us as co-rapporteurs, we represent the Parliament in the negotiations with the Council, and we are now at the heart of these negotiations and these trilogues together with the Spanish presidency and the Commission. And I am hopeful and confident, I would say, that within a month, plus minus, we would be ready to conclude these negotiations.
Okay, nice. That's a good date, and many thanks for this explanation. And now, for providing some general context, and given the fact that our audience, as you already mentioned, consists of non-legal experts in the field, could you give a brief explanation of the necessity of this regulation for the EU? What does the human-centric approach to AI mean for this proposal?
I've heard over the last couple of years since I have been dealing with this topic, I've heard all sorts of metaphors trying to explain what AI is or to compare it with something. I've heard people comparing it with the fire or with the steam engine or with electricity or with atomic energy, all of this basically wanting to express how important AI is, how much of a transformation and how profound this transformation is and will be for our societies, economies, and even democracies. And as I always say, no matter what comparison you make, you look at any of these technologies, they all had something in common. First, they had a period of pioneering, of Wild West, of lack of control, development and deployment in the absence of any sort of rules, until we, the humanity in us, discovered that there are risks associated to any of these technologies. With fire, we learned that we can burn or we can burn a village with it. With electricity, the same thing. With cars, with engines, with any piece of technology, of course, we saw the potential and the benefits, and we used it because of those benefits, but also soon we discovered the risks. And what did we do when we discovered the risks? As humans, we tried to protect ourselves. We put rules in place to make sure that the use of these technologies is one that does not cause us harm, that does not come in detrimental to our interests in society. Same thing with AI. AI has been around us for some time. Maybe many of us did not realize it, but it has been around us for some time. It has already started to produce a lot of benefits, from healthcare to optimizing processes around us in factories, in the way we consume energy, so on and so forth. But at the same time, little by little, we also started to see the risks. So as societies, and we as policymakers responsible and elected to be responsible for the good work in our societies and for the evolution in our societies. And now I come to the human-centric element of it. It is human-centric because these rules are meant to protect us as humans in the way we interact, in the way we use this technology. So that's how we have to understand it. The technology is now ripe enough to come to a point where we need to put some rules in place. And the second argument for necessity is that leaving it solely to the self-discipline of the companies that are developing or deploying these algorithms, this technology, is not enough. We have played for the last couple of years in this sort of an environment where we had general principles that were meant to provide some guidance to companies as to what we thought would be a human-centric approach to AI, but we realized that principles are not enough. We've had OECD principles for quite some time, UNESCO principles. We had ourselves in the EU principles adopted already 4 or 5 years ago. Did they bring that sort of change and that mitigation of risks in the last couple of years? It did not, or not sufficiently. That is why we have come at a stage where we believe that rules are important, hard law is important, so that obligations and standards are clear, and they're the same for everyone.
Yeah, pretty clear. Obligations should be in place. There are risks within these technologies. So I want to ask you about this risk-based approach in the regulation. The proposal as of today is tailored to specific levels of risk. To that end, the draft AI Act distinguishes between AI system posing an acceptable risk, high risk, limited risk, low or minimal risk. Could you provide us with a comprehensive summary of the types of activities being considered in each of those categories? I know it's difficult, and I know these will also come with the years, but also in the same context. Could you explain to the audience what general purpose AI means and what rules could apply to it?
So to understand the logic of the whole text, because if you understand this risk-based approach, you understand how we have approached this legislation. We asked ourselves the question at the very start, well, not we in Parliament, but the Commission, when preparing this legislation, what would be the best approach to regulate? How to best tackle the benefits and the need to also promote innovation, because that's a very important objective to have when you speak of such a transformational industrial revolution as AI is, and at the same time protect the interests, as I mentioned earlier, of individuals and society. So the conclusion was that the best is to look at the use cases of this technology, the use cases of AI, and then categorize those use cases that are producing risks. And depending on the severity of the risks, those that bring about very severe risks, so severe, so detrimental to the interests that you want to protect, that they just need to be prohibited, as simple as that. As you said, this is the first category of risk. And then high-risk use cases of AI, which means that they are not prohibited. They can still be developed. They can still be deployed in our markets. We would still be interacting, using them. But in order to mitigate those risks, we allocate some clear responsibilities, some obligations on those developers or those deployers of high-risk applications to make sure that their deployment is done safely, that their development is done safely, that the way they are trained is done safely, that the way they are being put in contexts where we interact with them as humans, all this is done safely. Why? Because it is the only way that we can trust it. And if there is no trust in this technology, then there is no uptake in technology. And then those economic or societal benefits that I mentioned earlier that we want to have will not be there. So it's all about trustworthiness. That's the key word next to the human centricity approach of the text. Then there is a third category of low risk, and then a broad base of AI that would simply not be regulated, and that's very important to understand. In fact, you have only a limited number of applications that would come under rules and compliance. The idea is to leave still room for innovation, room for creativity, room for development without rules in place for those AI applications that would not be impacting with our rights at all. So let's start with the tip of the pyramid, as it's called, the pyramid of risk. At the tip are the prohibited applications. I'll give some examples. Social scoring. Social scoring is what China does to put its citizens into different categories, different scores, based on the behavior, their political or social behavior. And depending on that score, you access services, you interact with the state, with the society, with other fellow citizens, you get credit or you don't get a credit in the bank, you get to a school or you don't get to a school, you get to put your kids into university or you don't. So it's all about the social score, which is done on the basis of your aggregate behavior in society, and we know what it means in China. It's your aggregate behavior towards the state, towards the Communist Party. That is all done, helped by very potent AI algorithms that are basically monitoring everything that the Chinese citizen does from morning till evening. Do we want that in our society? That's a very simple question that we have to ask. Our answer politically is that, of course, we don't. And if we don't want that use of technology, because again, it's not the technology that we need to blame, it is how it is being used. So we say, this use of AI, we do not want it in our society. As simple as that, which is why we prohibit it. Same thing for remote biometric identification in public spaces, which basically means AI-driven state surveillance all the time, everywhere we are in a public space. Do we want that? Is that congruent with our aspirations in terms of privacy? We say no. Same thing for predictive policing. So there is a list of applications, again, which in our views as policymakers are totally incompatible with how we understand our rights in our societies, in our democracies today. So this is at the tip of the pyramid. These are the prohibited applications. Then the second floor of the pyramid is the high risk. As I mentioned earlier, they would be able to be placed on the market, but in certain conditions. And the approach that the regulation takes is that it lists in an annex, and I'll explain in a second why in an annex. It lists in an annex the domains, the use cases where AI, if it is used, becomes high risk. In banking and granting credits in a bank, in insurance, in the health sector, in education, in certain contexts in employment and recruitment processes, safety components in critical infrastructure. So there is a list of such domains, if I would call it like that, where deploying AI needs to be done with certain safeguards, with certain obligations. Again, I underline, it's not that you can no longer develop or create or innovate AI in those sectors, but you have to do it in accordance with certain safeguards in order to protect, again, the interests of humans. And it is linked to a provision in the text. I explained earlier why it is in an annex. It is in an annex because from the start we realized that it would be impossible to keep this legislation in sync with the evolution of technology if we are not able to constantly update this technical manifestation of AI. Not the underlying obligations. They remain fixed. Transparency remains fixed. No matter how complex the application is, the transparency about the data sets that you use in training remains the same. So that part of the text is something that will stand the test of time. But the actual concrete manifestation, the technical one, the description of the domains which become high risk or not, is something that does depend on how the technology evolves. And that's why they are in an annex, so that they can be easier adapted, easier modified via a much lighter process that we have at the European level, which is called comitology. Then there is a third category, which is low risk. That is chatbots, for example, that we interact with very often, or deep fakes that, again, they do bring about some risks, but where the only obligations in our view that are necessary is transparency. We need to know when we interact with a chatbot. We need to know when we interact with an algorithm that is producing images or text or videos, so that we know and we can differentiate between when it is that we interact with a human and when it is that we interact with machine. And then, as I said, there is a broad base of other applications which are considered to be low risk, which means that they do not come under the scope of the regulation at all. Then there was a question about general purpose. And we have asked ourselves that question from the very start. What do we do with that AI that does not have, as it is designed and put on the market, it does not have a purpose in itself, right? And as I said, we are judging the severity of risks or the level of risk depending on the use case, right? On the use that is being given to that AI. But what do we do with general purpose, which again, it is a language processor, for example, or an image processor. It does not have a use that is in itself, if you look at it, risky or risk prone. So, but at the same time, and as this technology evolved, a couple of years ago, many were saying, you don't need to do anything about general purpose AI. And in fact, there was a very strong argument, and that is why also the Commission itself, in the initial proposal, did not put a single word about general purpose in the text. Later on in the Council, and then us in Parliament started to look into that. The Council decided that they will introduce rules related to the value chain of AI when it comes to general purpose that is being put on the market and that is taken on by others in the value chain and being put to use, and sometimes put to use in high-risk contexts. And then the question was, how do you differentiate the liability, the responsibility between the various actors in the value chain? We in Parliament went even further than the value chain discussion. Yes, the value chain is a very important conversation to have, and there needs to be a very clear allocation of responsibilities along it. And we have also done that in our mandate in Parliament. But we have also recognized, and by the time we're having that conversation, also the first signs of very potent large language models or foundation models, as they were called, such as ChatGPT, started to appear. And then there was a gradual awakening, not only society, but also of policymakers around the globe as to the risks associated with these models. Because we realized that there are risks that are associated with these models, irrespective of how they are used, because of how they are built, because of the huge amounts of data that is being used to train them, which includes not only positive things, but also bad things as they happened to find themselves on the internet out there. And we realized that, and not we realizing, there were already very concrete examples. And I think in Spain, just 2 weeks ago, there was one of those concrete examples with pornography being produced out of nothing, out of innocent photographs. And this is only one example of risks that are associated to the large language models in themselves, to how, again, they are built, how potent, how versatile they are. Again, the type of data that they are being trained with. And which is why we in Parliament, we said there need to be a set of rules that are also associated with the development of these models. Not heavy, because again, we don't want to put an unnecessary burden on the developers of these technologies, but there needs to be a minimum level of diligence, of responsibility in how you train the model, how you instruct the model, how you make sure that it is as much as possible. It's a due diligence obligation. It's not an obligation of result. But you have to prove that you have done everything in your power to make sure that the model does not produce illegal content, such as pornography. And then also, very importantly, an obligation about copyrighted material. Copyrighted material that is used in the training of the algorithms and for which the holders of the rights of that copyright material need at least to know. So a minimum obligation of transparency so that afterwards the holders of the rights can decide for themselves whether they want to pursue their rights further or not. So that's, in a nutshell, the logic of the text and how the various levels of risk are being treated in the text.
It was a great explanation. You have been answering a lot of questions that the audience, I think, that do have of this regulation. So many thanks. And following the audience, we belong to the digital advertising ecosystem, and considering that artificial intelligence could improve for example, efficiency of advertising expenses while increasing revenue of publishers and fostering the open web. And moreover, AI could promote advertising services based on inferences that require a lower amount of personal data and could facilitate advertising allocation. In what type of risk categorization would these services fall? And could codes of conduct be part of the solution for our activity?
Well, I'll start with the second one. Codes of conduct can, of course, be complementary to what we do. Just as they were, let's say, part of the current reality until hard law comes into place. Again, nothing can stop companies or sectors that are using or developing or deploying artificial intelligence to basically agree on a voluntary scheme of responsibility and of principles of minimum behavior when either developing or deploying some of these tools on the market in the respective sector. So again, codes of conduct can, of course, be a great complementary instrument. It also shows, from my point of view, a level of or a higher degree of awareness and responsibility for individual sectors who understand better than anybody else what are the characteristics of the sector, how does that sector interplay with AI, how it is being used concretely, and maybe there are certain elements that are so specific to that sector that a code of conduct can actually help on top of the rules that we make at a horizontal level. Now to the question is, would the precise example that you gave me fit into one of the risk categories? Honestly, from what I hear, not necessarily. I don't see how and where they would fall, but of course it depends on the instrument itself. But an AI that optimizes the use of data, so actually you need less data to be able to conduct advertising, online advertising that is being done right now. For me, this is an interesting optimization that, if in itself does not use personal data and is only done to optimize the process, I don't see why that would fall under the scope of the regulation. But again, each example and each type of application will have to be judged on its own merits.
Yeah. Of course. Thank you for this explanation, Dragos. Okay, and following also advertising services and a more general position now of the EU Parliament, AI technology used in recommender systems displayed by social media platforms, the ones designated as very large online platforms under the DSA, would be considered high-risk systems. What will this high-risk system categorization imply for these social media platforms, VLOPs?
Well, the same kind of obligations that I mentioned earlier for all the other high-risk categories, the same would apply, at least in our view. This is something that we introduced in Parliament. It does not exist in the Council mandate and did not exist in the Commission initial proposal. So there is a lot of let's put it this way, political activity around this topic. I cannot guess whether this will remain in the text or not. We are in negotiations, as I said, right now. This is one of the parts of the text which is still open, is still fluid, and open to negotiation. So we'll see how that survives. There is I think, a reasonable argument, which we also considered ourselves in Parliament when we negotiated this part of the text, that says that DSA already deals with VLOPs, with very large platforms and social media. And because there are already clear responsibilities there, particularly when it comes to risks, to significant or structural risks to some of these platforms and how they function, then we should not deal with them under the AI Act. Our arguments for putting it in is that, yes, indeed, the DSA establishes a list of obligations, including mitigating structural risks in the functioning of the algorithms, but there are other obligations that we have in the AI Act, horizontal obligations that we put for all of the high-risk categories, which could actually come complementary to the obligations that the very large platforms would have under the DSA. And therefore, there is a case, from our point of view, to actually have both the DSA with its part of the rules and the AI Act with its part of the rules, because that has to do with very clear obligations, again, on how you train and you deploy those algorithms. And there was a lot of discussion on the algorithms optimizing certain type of content in some of the platforms. I will not name them in particular, but I think everyone remembers the scandals of a year or 2 years ago when some whistleblowers from some of these companies came publicly listing how deliberately, in fact, some of these platforms were optimizing algorithms in a certain way to maximize profit over responsibility for content, knowing quite well that the content that they were accelerating via their platforms was disinformation often. So again, the issue is how to make sure that we bring about sufficient a level of obligations and accountability for this type of behavior. And again, we continue to believe that what we do under the AI Act is complementary to the DSA. Of course, we have to be very clear in our text, if it is to survive the negotiations, on how the two texts talk to each other, to ensure the interoperability between the assessment that is being done under the DSA and the assessment that will be done under the AI Act. And of course, as lawmakers, we will act as diligently as possible to make sure that we are not putting unnecessary hindrance, but we do what we want to do, which is to protect our citizens and our society from harm.
Yes, as an industry, the interoperability and the manage of all the legal frameworks in the EU is complex. So it's really nice you mentioned this. Okay, for finishing, I have two last questions. The first one is regarding two concepts that we haven't talked a lot, the concepts of providers and users. What are their main difference in terms of the proposal? And could some general technical toolkits or software libraries be considered as providers? Because you received a lot of feedback within this regulation. I've been reading all the feedback, and a common issue is these general definitions that could lead, for example, a user using a general purpose AI for new application become a provider. Are you worried about this? Have you been talking about this general approach?
Yeah, it is one of the many concerns that we had from the very start of this negotiation, which is clarity. Clarity of language, clarity of obligations, clarity of definitions, understanding that without this clarity, it is going to be difficult for those that want to achieve compliance to do it with as little cost as possible. And also generally for the certainty that you owe as a legislator to those that are becoming subject of the law that you write. So how did we handle that? First of all, we've tried to sharpen as much as possible definitions. And that includes the definition of providers. That is why, for example, in Parliament, we changed the definition of user and the terminology of user, because that was confusing. In the mind of the Commission, the user was those that were deploying an algorithm, that were taking an AI and then they were deploying it in a particular context. Those were the users. In our mind, a user could easily be confused with someone who sits at the very end of the AI value chain, the one who is the subject in a way, the one who interacts with the, in the common language, when you say user, you're thinking of that, which is why we changed the terminology and we've introduced this idea of deployer. So a provider, a deployer, and then an end user. And we've also, looking at the value chain, we wanted to make very clear what is the responsibility of the provider. So those that are developing, putting on the market an AI application. What are the responsibilities of a deployer, the one who takes an AI from the market? It can be general purpose or already with a clear purpose, and then puts it in a complete context, and then deploys it there and lets it to do its work, either interacting with users or optimizing a process within that entity. And then we also asked the question. So first of all, we've made these distinctions very clear. And then the question was, what happens if one of these deployers takes an AI algorithm, again, either already with a given purpose or a general purpose algorithm, changes it in order to better adapt it to the context in which it wants to deploy, changes it in the sense that it gives other training data, or it changes the instructions and it asks the algorithm to do something else than what initially the developer intended it to do, the provider intended it to do. And in that case, we've introduced the idea of significant change. Significant change, which means that if you induce a significant change to an algorithm, that means that you are then taking on the responsibilities of the provider. So you become a provider, or the equivalent of a provider in terms of the obligations that you have because of the significant change that you brought to the algorithm, which means that in case you are deploying it in a context that is high risk, then as a deployer, you have to yourself go through the compliance and the obligations that are listed there for providers under the high risk application. So that is how we have understood the value chain, and we have tried to bring clarity to all this.
Okay, thanks, Dragos. Let's see what changes being done from the Parliament position stays in the text, as you mentioned before, and this general concept of significant changes. So we are reaching the end of this interview. So only one last question. You mentioned that you expect that in 1 month from here, we are going to have an initial agreement of this regulation. Later, we will have more negotiations. So do you think we're going to see significant advances in the AI Act, given the fact as Spain is currently holding the presidency of the EU Council and is really interested in this regulation? And could you provide us with some important dates and the best case scenario for a final agreement on this regulation?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I'm confident that we can finish certainly during the Spanish presidency. There is full commitment on the side of the presidency, and I applaud them for that. There is full commitment on our side as Parliament, and there is also full commitment on the side of the Commission, which is in these negotiations, as always, acting as an honest broker to provide technical solutions to the political conversations and compromises that we are making in the course of the negotiations. We are very deep into this process right now. We had last week a political trilogue where we've made some advances. We've clarified what are the remaining political points that need to be addressed. We've also given some clear mandates to the Commission to help out with concrete text proposals for some of these political points that are left open. So with that, I am confident that in the next trilogue that we have at the end of October, even then, possibly we could actually even finish, or at maximum, we would need another political trilogue in November. So I think that we are at the end of the process. Still, again, some important political points to address, but I am convinced, looking at the commitment on all sides, that we can address them. What does that mean in practice? it means that if we have a political agreement now in the month of October or November, there will be some time lag afterwards where at the technical level, the lawyer linguists, they are all sifting through the text, aligning political, technical language and concepts with the political agreement that was made. That, given the size of the text and the complexity of the text, might take actually maybe even another month. So from the moment of the political agreement to the moment when the text is ready to go for a final vote in Parliament, because both institutions need to then confirm the result of the negotiations in respective votes. So the Council needs to vote on it, and then we as Parliament need to vote on it. And only when those two votes happen, then the agreement is formally and the act is formally adopted. On our side, it can mean either the plenary in December, that is the earliest that I can see the vote being scheduled, or the very latest in the plenary in January. From that moment onwards, from the moment of adoption, we will have the period of implementation, which can be most likely between a year and a half, because everyone is eager to actually have this apply already. Many are saying that we have elections next year. How do we address the issue of disinformation and AI-powered fake news and fake videos and all that? So there are many who want actually the rules to come into force much quicker. But we have to understand that there's an important time needed for authorities to prepare for implementation, both at national level and at EU level, but also for companies to prepare for compliance. But I think that the important thing is that they're now in the final stretch, and we will have the rules by the end of this year.
Okay, so let's see if by the end of the year we have the rules in place. Dragos, it was a real honor to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I wish the best success with the AI Act and the following dates. Many thanks again.
Thank you.
And now a few words in Spanish. Gracias a la audiencia también por estar con nosotros hoy. Si tenéis algunas preguntas, enviárnosla al correo de Inspirational, inspirational@iavspain.es, y estaremos en contacto. So, Dragos, thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
It was a pleasure. Yeah, same for you.